want some sauce?
Scene 1, Apple, take 1.
My backyard is full of clay, and it makes it very difficult to grow anything. And what you're looking at is an area that years ago I had dug out, and I had put some garden soil and compost and stuff in order to try to grow vegetables and things like that. And it's a small area because the soil is just so compacted and just so full of clay. I couldn't even dig much more than about 6 to 8 inches, and it didn't work out. And then, you know, quite honestly, I'm going to need a jackhammer or something to really dig a considerable amount. And I know there's clay in there because when I was digging before, it was in there. So I'm going to remove this top layer of junk that's on there anyway, and try to get back down to that hardness, that level that's really hard, that's got the clay in it. Okay, so right here, I can't even really get in there because the amount of clay and stuff. But I'm going to put all this in a bucket, and there's also a lot of rocks in here. First amount, I think that's good. Now this stuff is really hard, and some of this, you know, is some soil from the top, but this right here, that's got clay in it. That's why it's kind of giving me these dirt clods. Okay, that's got clay in it. So, and I know it does because if you water that area and you wait for like a day, like after it's like heavy rains, man, your foot just like gets glued in there. It's horrible, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this stuff soak in water maybe a couple of days or so, just to loosen up those dirt clods. Some people will take this and bang it with a hammer. I'm not going to waste my time. I'm going to just let the water do the work for me. But let it break up, and then in small increments filter out the rocks and stuff like that. See, this feels like a rock, but this is clay as well. Luna, would you please move? Will you quit trying to hog the camera up? I don't know what's with you. You're a ham. Talk about an exfoliant. This will clean up those dead skin cells off your hand. Okay, so that is step 1. Okay, so now we're going to be going to step 2. And what I'm doing here is going to be straining this stuff, okay? And anything that looks like it hasn't been broken down enough, I can just throw it back inside here and do a few rinses, and we'll be okay. And this is going to clog up pretty quick. This is actually quite heavy. Let me get something. So this is pretty much already getting clogged with organic matter and stuff. Okay, it's starting to get a little thicker, getting a little bit more clay in there. So until all this organic material really comes out, this is going to be a kind of a slow process. Now there is clay that is suspended in this water right here. Okay, that's what's giving it its color, and we want those fine particles to settle to the bottom. So at this point, I need to find a different bucket. and let this stuff set. As the water on top clears, I can pour it off and continue. It's interesting, this stuff is starting to smell like an aquarium. Maybe that's because where I live used to be underwater. Meaning a ancient ocean. So this is basically what ends up happening is you pour it and then the fine silt and stuff in the clay sinks to the bottom, right? And I have transferred all of the other buckets. I took a lot of the clear water out and then just poured them all in this one. So now everything in here is like the concentrate. And here in the next day or so, this water, some of it's going to evaporate as well as some of it is going to end up, the particles are going to sink and it's going to become more clear. When that happens, I'm going to pour the water off. And eventually we're going to end up getting to sand, fine sand, and clay, right? And then depending on how many, what kind of mesh I'm using to strain it through, that's going to determine how much clay to sand there is, right? Obviously the finer it is, the better the clay is going to end up being. With the sand, you know, larger particles, you know, when you're using the screen, right? So anyway, let's give it a couple more days and let gravity do its work. So I have a old lab coat here that I have doubled up, and I'm using the lab coat because of the tightness of the threads compared to like a cotton shirt, which will expand and open up and whatnot. This is going to end up leaving a lot more of the silt behind, and it's going to be a slower drain, but it's going to give me a better clay. So I'm going to end up pouring the water and clay mixture into this and letting it drain. This is going to be a slow going process, but this is going to end up getting rid of a lot of the water. You'll see we still have some organic material inside here. This is some roots, particles of roots and stuff in there, and we're going to have to get those out because anything like that gets stuck in the clay during the time that you're like baking it or cooking it, it can actually end up creating problems. So it's important to get all of that stuff out of there. Okay, so it's going to get to a point where I've got a decent amount of water inside here, and I keep pouring this in here, and eventually I'm going to get to the bottom here where we end up having like a very, very thin clay, but this has also got sand in it. And so what we're going to end up doing is if we take this and we put it inside here, let me get another scoop here. I'm trying to do this with one hand. But if we get this and we kind of just stir this in the water that's currently down there, let me get or if we just kind of get this and we shake it in the water, what this ends up doing is it kind of takes the fine particles out and it leaves the larger ones in there. So it leaves like the sand in, right? So just by kind of doing this, and then slowly raising it up. Okay, we got to do it again. Okay, one more time. And at this point, what we have right here, there's a lot of sand in it. You see that? How it's mostly sand. And then the sand might give a little bit of temper to the clay, but at the same time, too much of it's going to make it where it's not pliable, right? So we're trying to get the sand out, and I'm going to keep doing this over and over and over until I get as much of the sand out as I can. And we are going to lose a little bit of the clay with it, but as long as we lose a lot of sand, we're good. Okay, so I've just kind of tied that in a knot, and I'm going to let the water slowly seep out of this, let the sun kind of help dry it. It's too heavy right now to really hang up. It probably weighs a good 25 pounds. It's pretty heavy. So I'm not going to end up hanging this up, but maybe by tomorrow enough water will have kind of wicked out of this that I can go ahead and hang it, because I don't like keeping it on the ground like this, because my dog might get into it, or wild animal or something. But we'll check it out tomorrow. Okay, so it's been sitting out here for a couple of days, and the moisture that's been in here has been wicking away and evaporating. And let's take a look at this and see basically what we've got here. Okay. It's still a little wet, okay, and it's got a decent amount of sand in here still, but this area right here is not as wet. You can see because it's cracking, but this I think is going to be okay for certain applications. It's pretty damn sticky. I think it's going to be pretty good for some applications, but there is still a considerable amount of sand in it. There's still a considerable amount of water in this, okay? But you'd want to reduce the amount of sand with a smaller strainer. So you would wet this again, and then you would just run it through a smaller sieve, right? But when you coil it and you bring it around, if it breaks after it gets to the proper dryness, if it cracks, it tells you that there's too much sand in it, okay? But you also might notice that this is if you take the soil from your yard like this, or anywhere really, that it might have a strange smell to it, okay? And you have to remember that there's very, very small organic matter in the soil, and there is bacteria, and there's different things that are inside there. You mix water inside there, some of it's going to start decomposing, some of it's going to end up just maybe multiplying, some of this other stuff is going to decompose, so you are going to smell something that's going to be a little off, okay? But if you fire it, it should be okay, but this essentially is how you go about making your own clay with what you have in your backyard, as long as you have a lot of clay in your soil. I think that this particular one right here has got a little too much sand in it, okay? I can kind of tell already by looking at it, but I think if I get a finer sieve, a finer screen, and run it through there and do this one more time, I'm going to have a very good clay. And I'm going to probably end up using this to try to make a bust. I'm not sure yet. We'll see what happens. But that is that, guys. And hopefully you enjoyed that. And if I end up making a bust and something like that, I'll end up doing a video on how I go about doing that as well. I used to have an art channel that I haven't really been very active on in a long time. And I don't know, maybe I'll put it on there too, just so the subscribers over there know that I'm still alive. But anyway, guys, that is that. And until next time, I'll talk to you later.